Yeah, and I mean, I think there's a decent amount of foreign investment out there, but I think it definitely gets skewed. You read one article, you see some of these stats, and all of a sudden, a foreign buyer and foreign ownership is a huge issue. But I think these bans, they seem to be filled with loopholes, and you don't have to be too clever to figure out a way around some of these rules. But obviously, the intent of the government is to use these political bans and this new legislation to cool this hot market, even though we've already been experiencing quite the cooling.
Yeah, for sure. For sure. Yeah. And even in the data, it does show a lot of it, we're just seeing that demand shift to new construction homes because the resale market isn't the lucrative piece. If you're buying capital appreciation, you can get levered exposure to it by just buying pre-construction contracts, basically. Let's jump to the next one here. Despite affordability challenges, the desire to own a home is growing, according to an Ontario Real Estate Association survey. So it says the hurdles to homeownership may be higher these days, but so too is the desire to be a homeowner. And we're going to get to the hurdles when we go through the National Bank's housing affordability monitor, which is an awesome quarterly report. Nearly 7 in 10 homeowners, or 69%, said they really want to own a home, a 9 percentage point increase since January, according to a new poll commissioned by the Ontario Real Estate Association. No bias there. At a time when homeownership rates are on the decline, the desire to own a home is still growing, said Stacey Eboy, president of OREA. Despite a decline in home prices over much of the year, affordability did not improve, which we'll get to later, because of the rapid rise in interest rates.
This actually ties in nicely to a piece from The Economist. Dan, you and I both love The Economist. They put out a ton of great data that we use. And this was about the best places to live in North America. And if you haven't seen this list, you may be surprised to know that Canadian cities ranked first to fourth as the best places to live in North America. So that does not include Mexico, but that does include Hawaii, which I don't see on the top 5 or 10 anywhere. So the first one being Calgary. Number 2 is Vancouver. Number 3 is Toronto. Number 4, Montreal. Then we go to the first represented place in the States as Hotlanta, better known as Atlanta. Then all the way down the list, New York at 21. Houston takes 23rd, and Detroit, Rock City, at 24th. So I'm not going to lie, Dan, I'm a little surprised about this list. But before we move on, let's look at what this list was based on. So it's based on the livability of a city, but what makes a city livable? Now, there are more than 30 factors related to education, culture, the environment, healthcare, infrastructure, and stability were all analyzed to get to these data points. The index's author also explained that the top cities were chosen by how they have rebounded from the pandemic, in addition to factoring in the stability, good infrastructure and services, and enjoyable leisure activities. Now, Dan, you posted this on Twitter. Why don't you tell us what some of the responses from the lovely Twitter crowd was?
Yeah, Twitter loved it. I think it's, obviously affordability isn't what this is not a map or a
It's
list
not
of.
the affordability
I
map.
mean,
No,
yeah, yeah,
no.
certainly not. So obviously, there's a price to pay if you want these factors that the Economist is relying on. So, the first response to the tweet thread that you're mentioning there, Nick, is how much did the Canadian government pay the Economist to produce these results? The next one is NYC ranking below Toronto, Seattle below Vancouver, Houston below Calgary. I'm not even going to address Montreal.
Oh, that's mean.
Then the next one is weather a consideration in this? Because if it is, then I seriously doubt the methodology. And the final one is Rolls Royce and Porsche also top best cars to drive list, which is, really, really good summary of the problem, actually.
It really is. And listen, we all know the Twitter crowd for being a nice, understanding group of people. So we appreciate all the comments, everybody. This is another great segue. Wow, it's almost like someone planned these segues here. This is a really good segue to our next piece, which is titled "A $200,000 plus income is now needed to qualify for the average mortgage in Toronto and Vancouver. Probably also need to be making more than $200,000 to be driving a Porsche Rolls Royce, but we'll leave that for a different podcast. So this is a great piece, and we've got a chart in front of us here, which is the RBC Housing Affordability Measures for Canada. Dan, why don't you walk us through the first few points here?
Yeah, so in Vancouver and Toronto, to qualify for a home for valued at basically the benchmark price, buyers now require an income of $268,000 and $240,000 respectively, according to this report. Victoria is a close third, where buyers need at least $216,000 to qualify. RBC's analysis is interesting, and the chart here is great, although it only goes back to 89. So, we'll
Great
cover
year.
this a little bit more exhaustively. Yeah, 89 was a great year. But, to really get an understanding for this, housing affordability was at its worst in the early 1980s, which doesn't show on this chart. And we will cover that when we go through National Bank's similar analysis, because they have almost the same chart here. So I won't get it too into the weeds here on this, but jump into this quote here, Nick.
Yeah, skyrocketing home prices earlier in the pandemic raised the bar by several notches for the Canadian buyers. But the spike in interest rates since March served a crushing blow in parts of the country. It's never been so unaffordable to buy a home.
The pressure on buyers is being felt not only in the country's most expensive cities, but in mid-sized markets from coast to coast. Here's a look at the minimum incomes required to qualify for a mortgage on a typical home in various cities across Canada. Ottawa, $149,000, Montreal, $127,000, Calgary, $123,000, and Halifax, $116,000.
We jump to Edmonton at $99,000, Saskatoon at $89,000, Regina, $79,000, St. John, $74,000, and St. John's, $77,000.
So these are the minimum incomes required to purchase a home. Now let's take a look at some of the average salaries across the country to see if that's even remotely achievable. So I'm going to pull this up. We have Nunavut at 87,355. Now this is an individual salary, I think, not average household income.
This is individual salaries, yeah.
Northwest Territory 77,000, Alberta 61,000, Yukon 61,000, Ontario just 55,000, Newfoundland and Labrador 55,000.
We move on to Saskatchewan at 54,000, just over. British Columbia 53,516, Quebec at 51,735. Manitoba just under the 50,000 mark at 49,661. New Brunswick 49,511, Nova Scotia 40,470, and Prince Edward Island at 45,950. Now, Dan, before we move on, it's kind of crazy to see that Ontario at 55,000 and BC at 53,000 when we know it is crazy expensive to live. And we just went over talking about the fact that you need $200,000+ as income to live there. So you got to have 4 people with average salaries to be able to even qualify for a standard mortgage in one of those 2 provinces. Kind of scary.
Yeah, I think the interesting part there as well is this is how you end up on the UBS bubble index, right? Where you have this, because that UBS bubble index, when we revisited it, we did a whole episode on it. It's called The Biggest Real Estate Bubble in the World, I think. So you go check it out. But it reads as a list of all of the top cities in the world, all of the world-class cities, let's call them. And what happens in a lot of these places, you get this huge income to price disparity in the real estate asset. And functionally what that is a result of is income disparity in these cities. You have a lower kind of like service class, and then you have a lot of knowledge work and this global talent competing for wages and sort of like the upper, and Canada is very much seeing that happen, especially in our 2 bigger cities, Toronto and Vancouver, 2 more expensive cities, Toronto and Vancouver, in sort of what's called the K-shaped recovery, right? Where you have a bottom line that kind of goes down and a top line that goes up on the K-shaped recovery. And it kind of makes you wonder, we're exporting tech talent to Silicon Valley. So we train some of the best tech people in Kitchener, Waterloo, Cambridge at the universities there, and they can go and get paid far better. And there's a CBRE report on this that we can put into another episode. But Toronto and Vancouver have some of the least competitive tech wages in the world. So the question is like, who can afford these houses, and what are the best paying jobs in Canadian market? The employment sectors with the highest paying wages in Canada are energy and natural resources, finance and insurance, and scientific and technical services. So not the tech sector growth that we're hearing all of these cities tout happening. In fact, actually, in the Canadian market, tech is very much a race to the bottom. So mining, oil, and gas extraction average salary or highest paying wages is $113,000. Utilities is over 100,000. Finance and insurance 76,000.
Yeah, if we move on to professional, scientific, and technical services, we're still at about the 76,000 mark. And just below that in public administration, so government employees make about 75,000, 76,000. So looking at these numbers, you start to see why more and more people are buying homes together, are doing the drive to you quantify, drive to you quantify, or are using co-signers at, I believe, probably one of the highest rates we've ever seen. And just through the research done for this episode, I think co-signing deserves a full episode. So stay tuned for that.